You don't ever expect to be hauled out of your house, put on a train, and marched into a gas chamber and be choked to death. There is something in all of us that, no matter how terrible it is, that you want to live another day.
Irene Fogel Weiss is about to speak to an auditorium filled with students at Woodson High School. It's not the first time she's done this. As a former teacher, she has spent a lot of time talking to students. But these days, her lessons for students are quite personal. She's sharing her own story, the story of how she survived the Holocaust.
What made you decide to kind of talk about it and do presentations on it?
Well, I couldn't talk about it for at least 25 years. I really was sweaty palms and pounding heart. There was no way. You know, you can tell your parents were killed, you can tell your parents died, but you can't tell that you arrived to a place where the reason for being there was to be killed, and all the rest that went with it. So, and I didn't talk about it for a long, long time. But that horrific time in history should be passed down to the next generation. So that is why I'm speaking, to make sure that people know it and think about it and analyze it and learn from it.
Irene's story begins in a small town in Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. She lived there with her father, who ran a lumber yard, her mother, who stayed at home with the children, an older brother, an older sister, and 3 younger siblings. During her childhood, Irene and her family lived a very normal small-town life until the Nazi Party began to take hold across Eastern Europe. In 1939, the Germans annexed part of Czechoslovakia. The Hungarian government followed suit and annexed the area where Irene lived. Hungary had already embraced many of the Nazi beliefs. Suddenly, Irene's Jewish family had become subjects of a very anti-Jewish government. They were Hungarian Jews. Almost immediately, things in Irene's town began to change.
Hungary joined alliance with Germany, and so everything became Nazified. But I did go to Hungarian middle school by this time, and that's when I was 12, 13, where we had to wear a yellow star on our clothes. And so, you know, that was like a target, and certainly wasn't safe. It was a small farming town, and the 6th grade was the end of education. So our parents were very keen on sending us for more education. So as we got to be past 6th grade, by this time I was the 3rd one who was sent to the big city to commute. And I actually went on a train, which was most unusual. It was a one-track railroad town, and sometimes I was the only one getting on and off. And the farmers went by horse and buggy, you know, wherever they needed to go. And so I was traveling for a while where the train was full of soldiers and crowded and all that. But with the yellow star, I remember for a while I would pin the star on instead of just sewing it on permanently. I'd pin it on and walk to the train because I wasn't afraid in my town with it. When the train came, I took it off and put it in my pocket. And then I would, in the big city where I had to walk from the train to the school, I didn't put it on because there I had no protection whatsoever, you know. But this only lasted a few trips because once they stopped, they threw us out from school. There was no reason to go anymore. But it was a terrible thing because you were marked, you were a target.
The Nazis were slowly separating Jews from society, forcing them to wear a yellow star, banning them from schools, and using propaganda to portray them as the source of society's problems. Unfortunately, too many people were falling for it.
The farmers' young sons who suddenly had power All they had to do is put on a swastika band on their arm, and they were like deputized. They were the law. And so, and from other towns, these young guys would roam around and go to do harm to Jews. You know, they'd pull out an older man from the family, they'd think it's a good sport, they'd cut his beard, and anything like that was permitted, and the police would stand by, you know. So, and nobody felt secure anymore. One day I was coming home from visiting my grandparents with my father. I was on the train, and the train is a 5-minute ride, you know, and these young hoodlums, see, my father had a beard, a small, trimmed beard, but beards were not popular. I mean, there wasn't, only Jewish men had beards. Today, that's different. And so on the train, they came up to him, a couple of them, and they started talking to each other like, well, what shall we do? Wouldn't it be fun to throw him off the train? And laughing and carrying on, beginning to poke him and things like that. Nobody in the train said anything. Nobody lifted a finger or a voice, you know. I was like 12 and a half or something, and terrified. But looking out the window, I could tell we're approaching home, and that's exactly what saved my father. They were ready to throw him off.
Nazi practices included a systematic removal of all Jewish influences. Jewish businesses were marked and patrons were discouraged from entering. Irene's father lost his lumber business because it was seized outright by the Nazis with no compensation. Jewish citizens were suddenly forced to prove their citizenship in Hungary. To prove it, they had to have Nazi-approved documents, and the Nazis made those documents difficult to obtain. Jews who couldn't prove Hungarian citizenship were deported.
Even though my parents and grandparents were citizens, they put in every kind of handicap possible. My father actually spent a lot of time trying to acquire that by going from office to office and paying for everything. And eventually he got the paper. It was, I remember, they were almost celebrating. He came back with that paper, okay, we're safe. Every step of the way, from the time this happened until we ended up in Auschwitz, we always rationalized for the better, always thinking that, okay, it's getting worse, but we see some light. You know, people just can't accept the worst. And so here we had this paper, and we're safe. Except don't show yourself in the street, you know, don't get involved with the law in any way because they won't protect you. Nobody was safe. Even school kids, the younger ones than in high school, say, I have my rights. You know, you hear that in classroom. Well, what if you don't have any rights? And the police are on the other side. They don't protect you. They stand by while people do you harm or take out anything from your home. It's a very difficult concept that we were guilty of something. We were guilty of being alive just by virtue of being a Jew. You were hunted.
The German laws enforced in Hungary were only the beginning of the persecution of Hungarian Jews. The Nazis had created a comprehensive plan called the Final Solution of the Jewish Question. It was Nazi code for the complete annihilation of the Jewish people. By 1941, Hitler's SS and police forces had become mobile killing units, initiating the first large-scale murder of Jewish citizens, both by firing squad and by mobile gas vans. In 1942, concerned that their existing killing methods were not efficient enough, the Nazis had completed 3 extermination camps in Poland.
In April 1944, having already exterminated millions of Jews throughout Europe, the Nazis turned their attention to the last Jewish community that remained, 500,000 Jews in Hungary. The war was almost over, but the final solution was proceeding with speed and efficiency. We had heard rumors of mass shootings of Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland, and in the Ukraine. Then in the spring of 1944, local officials announced that the Jews in my town had 24 hours to get out of their homes with one suitcase each and assemble at the town hall. We had no idea what would happen to us. A delegation made up of the mayor, police chief, and my school principal arrived at our house demanding that we hand over money and valuables. People always say rationalize, okay, so we give them some money and jewelry and okay, just leave us alone type of thing. And so I know my father gave them some stuff, but he didn't have, by this time, he never had a lot, you know, he had 6 children to support and we were okay, but, you know, so, but that was after it was announced in the town that the next day all the Jewish families should report at a gathering place in the town. So we already knew that we're leaving, although we didn't know where. Nobody ever said where. So, you know, it was, everything was very scary, and for parents with 6 children, it must have been extremely terrifying if you don't know what will happen to your children and you can't protect them. After complying, we left the house. My father closed the gate behind us so that our dog wouldn't follow us. Along with about 100 other Jewish people in our town, my family was taken to an abandoned brick factory some miles away. There we joined thousands of Jewish families from neighboring towns. We were kept there almost a month in overcrowded conditions. Our food supply from home was quickly gone, and we became dependent on the daily soup ration.
Nazis ordered Jews to gather in a common area, leaving the bulk of their possessions behind for Nazi confiscation. The holding areas became known as ghettos. Most people who were sent to the ghettos had no idea that it was a staging area for transport to extermination camps. Irene was held in the Hungarian ghetto of Munkacs. There she endured many hardships and humiliations. Little did she know that it was the least of what she would experience in the coming year.
There were thousands of people there. They were calling it a ghetto, and there was no sanitation, and so they decided that, you know, lice and that sort of thing, they had a legitimate kind of health reason. But the way they put it is they made an announcement and said, all girls under 16 report to have their head shaved or their fathers will be punished. You know, we were not treated like human beings. They could have said it's a sanitary thing, it's to prevent, you know, but I was so terrified, I ran to the place to have my hair cut because my father would be punished. It was always like that, you know, so just cruelty. So my head was shaved. I had long pigtails at the time. And I wasn't so terribly upset about it because I already saw that my parents and my people were just being mistreated so badly. That's the least of it. The hair will grow back. But actually, I had no idea that it would give me the first cut at passing the selection when I got to Auschwitz.
In a strange twist of fate, the humiliation of having her head shaved in the ghetto would allow 13-year-old Irene to pass through her first life and death test by the Nazis. Though they did not know it at the time, Irene and her family were about to depart for one of the most lethal places in all of human history, the selection platform at Auschwitz-Birkenau.
In the middle of May, a freight train arrived at the tracks alongside the brick factory. My family gathered our belongings and joined the crowd heading for the boxcars. Nobody told us our destination, but we feared it would be Nazi-occupied Poland. My family struggled to keep together. We all managed to get into the same boxcar. For the sake of modesty, men moved to one side and women to the other side of the boxcar. A guard slammed the door shut and bolted it on the outside. Now it was dark in the train. A small slit in the top corner allowed some light to come in. Hours later, the train began to move. The only source of air was that small slit in the corner. There was a bucket for the toilet in the middle of the car. Hours passed, and a night and a day, the bucket filled up. Peering out the slit, my father confirmed everyone's worst fear. The train was crossing into Poland. Our knowledge of what was happening to Jews in other countries partly came from these Jewish families who were sent out deported because they were not citizens. And so some of them here and there would escape and come back, a single person. And they would tell stories about how in Nazi-occupied Poland, there were these people from all the other countries in Europe who were thrown out into the forests, literally there, plus the Polish people who were native, they were all being mowed down by Nazi gunfire. They just line them up and shoot people, and that's what was going on in Nazi-occupied Poland. And these people who came back and told us these stories, we didn't believe it. We did not believe it. We thought they're exaggerating. They had some trauma, they experienced something, but, so that was our knowledge of what's happening in Nazi-occupied countries. Not gas chambers, not crematoriums, not wholesale genocide, none of that. Finally, the train stopped. We are at some kind of a camp, my father announced. There are barracks here. This must be a work camp. Relief flooded over us. We were not going to be shot in the forest in Poland.
Most of the people on the train with Irene were unaware that extermination camps existed. They had no idea that they had just arrived at the most notorious of all Nazi death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau. When Irene arrived in May of 1944, Auschwitz Nazis were murdering an average of 6,000 Jews a day, most of them within an hour of getting off the train.
There was a lot of shouting, leave everything behind, get out, fast. My mother quickly unpacked some clothing and told us to put on more layers. My head had already been shaved in the ghetto, so I was wearing a scarf on my head. I jumped out of the boxcar, down onto the platform. About 2,000 other people emptied onto the platform. My family reached for one another urgently, trying to stay together in the swarm of people, the noise and the confusion. As soon as we were out of the train, all of our possessions were dumped onto the platform and were loaded into trucks. A guard shouted, men to one side, women and children to the other. In an instant, my father and 16-year-old brother were lined up in a huge column of men off to one side. I would never see them again. My mother, sisters, younger brothers, and I were in another large column of women and young children. A chimney was visible in the distance. Flames and smoke billowed from it. The column edged forward. When we reached the front, a dozen or more armed Nazi soldiers blocked our way. One of them held a small stick. The one with a stick motioned my sister, Serena, who was 17, to one side. In the next moment, he motioned my mother and two little brothers to the other side. They disappeared from view. Only my younger sister and I remained. I was holding her hand. The baton came down between us, sending my sister towards where my mother went. The Nazi guard looked at me and hesitated for an instant. Although I was only 13 years old and would have been selected with the children, my kerchief on my head and a big coat that I was wearing confused him. He motioned me in the direction where my older sister went and turned his attention to women and children lined up behind me. I hesitated to leave, trying to see whether my younger sister had caught up with my mother. it was not possible for me to see what happened to her in the crowd. I was devastated to think that she would be alone in this crowd, and so I lingered there for a little while.
This photo was taken by Nazi soldiers at the time Irene arrived at Auschwitz. It captures the moment when Irene lingered looking for her sister. Children didn't normally wear scarves on their heads, but Irene was covering her shaved head with a scarf and wearing the extra layers her mother gave her. It made her look much older and had likely just saved her life. 13-year-olds like Irene were generally seen as too young for labor and were immediately sent to the unfit line. Men, women, and children in the unfit lines were marched immediately to the gas chambers to die.
Serena and I were herded into a bathhouse where we were shaved, disinfected, and handed prison clothes. We were moved to a barrack with about 200 other women. We still didn't know where we were. We asked the other prisoners, when are we going to see our families? A woman pointed to a chimney and said, "Do you see the smoke? There is your family." In the following days, we were sent to work at a storage and processing area near crematorium number 4, where we sorted through mountains of clothes that came out of the trains and also out of the crematoriums and gas chambers. There were mountains of eyeglasses, toothbrushes, baby carriages, suitcases, household goods, every kind of item that people thought to bring with them. Because we worked and lived next to the crematorium and gas chamber, we soon had a first-hand knowledge of what had happened to our families. Day and night, columns of women and children and elderly passed by our barrack. We watched them enter the gate that led to the gas chambers. Sometimes they called out questions to us. By that point, nothing could save them. The sounds were magnified when we worked at night. First, I would hear the hissing of the steam engine arriving at the platform and the whistle of the train. And within a half hour, hundreds of women, children, and elderly would pass by our barrack and disappear into the entrance of the gas chambers. Those arriving at night saw the smoke and flames belching from the chimneys and even burning bodies in open pits. It looked to them that they were being herded into open flames. They prayed and cried and screamed, and I would plug my ears with my fingers. Day and night, the transports kept coming. The 5 gas chambers and crematoriums operated day and night, killing as many as 10,000 people a day.
Auschwitz was designed for one primary purpose: genocide. Blueprints of the facility showed deliberate designs implemented to make large-scale gassing and cremation an efficient operation. The sheer number of murders that took place there on a single day was inconceivable, even for someone who witnessed the horror firsthand.
I was at a window, I was looking, I saw them. They even called out questions to us. I saw these women, these beautiful little children, babies, sitting on the road waiting their turn. And I would, my eyes saw it, my brain didn't accept it, and my whole system didn't accept it. That's how I think I coped. And not just in retrospect, but I know that I did not have the ability to absorb it.
Although they were already losing the war, the Nazis seemed even more determined to murder as many Jews as possible. Irene and her family were among the more than 424,000 Hungarian Jews deported to Auschwitz in just 8 weeks. The killing machine quickly reached capacity.
The killing was backed up. 5 crematoriums, gas chambers worked day and night, but it still was backed up. And so these people are waiting their turn. They're at the gate, and they have no idea what they're waiting for. And that is my mother. And these 2 little boys next to her are my 2 little brothers. And they have no idea, but they are waiting their turn. And searching for my sister, she is not in the picture. Although I certainly understand what happened to all of them, it is still a painful thing to think that she was having to go through this terrible time by herself. The selection never ended. In Auschwitz, every day there was a selection, not just at the train ramp when people arrived. That was the biggest selection. But after that, they constantly looked to see if they missed somebody, especially children like me. And so every single day, I was in great jeopardy. They would line us in the morning. The routine was that they threw us out of our barracks at 5 in the morning for counting. It was a way of really torturing people. 5 a.m. in the morning, you're thrown out, lining up in rows of 5, and just standing there until about 9, 10 o'clock, when the German delegation would come out, all dressed up in their nice, clean, warm uniforms, having had breakfast and so on, and they would come and count us. And after that, we would be dismissed. And so every time there was this lineup every morning, they had a chance to look down that row and pick out the young ones they missed, the sick ones they missed, or someone who just they didn't like. They wanted some slave labor out of it, but as soon as you looked like you weren't capable of working, you had to be killed. When people were brought in there, the very first thing they did at the train platform is to separate children, babies, and their mothers, and kill them within a half an hour to an hour upon arriving. So there were no children in that place, and I, who was just 13 years old, was really considered a child. And I was not slave labor material. So I was never referred to as a child. The word child was not to be mentioned. We were very much aware that if they pull you out, you're going to die. And suddenly that becomes your life. And then you're also distracted by all the incredible, inhuman things that are happening to you. Added to that is starvation and all kinds of other humiliation. And suddenly you're very confused and very unsure of. I, as a child, I really thought that I was not even on this planet. I didn't think I was on Earth. Nobody knows this is here. Nobody can possibly know that when the trains come in, that 90% of the people are killed immediately, and there is a facility here just for that. This is just a place for killing, so it can't be on this Earth. I was terrified every moment of my time in Auschwitz. I look back and I think, oh, I was kind of brave, wasn't I? I was okay. Well, it seems like I wasn't. My sister tells me I cried all the time. I was absolutely terrified because I knew that they were looking for me, so to speak, but just everything, the hostility that was thick, you know, and that we were subhumans, we were dehumanized. That is such a terrible feeling that you can't, that you're most afraid of your fellow man. You know, I should have been in school and not in Auschwitz. Why was I there? And why was my father and family, why were they there? You know, people minding their own business, raising families.
Irene says that the system of terror that the Nazis instituted is still difficult to comprehend. In a matter of months, she had gone from being a normal teenager to a prisoner in horrendous conditions in a place where she watched hundreds of people march to their deaths every day. She knew by now that her mother and siblings had been sent to the gas chambers. Although her father had survived the selection platform, she learned that he too had been killed. Her parents, her siblings, her home, her friends, everything she knew as normal was gone.
We came from civilization. Certain things were expected. Certain things were normal. And suddenly to be taken into a place where nothing was familiar and hostility was enormous. We were looked upon as subhumans. They were the superior Aryan race. Races like the Slavic peoples, the Russians, the Poles, they would be designated as slave laborers to help the super race. And then there was the subhumans who had to be eliminated. The Nazi soldiers guarding us looked at us as subhumans. You could not look them in the eye. You know, when other human beings treat you as subhumans, it is a most terrifying feeling because you have no one to turn to. This is your support group. This is what you know, and suddenly you're not one of them. It's very, very difficult to ever bring back that trust because you could see how people can turn on you in a very vicious way. Very scary, truly, truly scary, because you have no place to turn, no one who identifies you as a fellow human being. I have a hard time expressing what it feels like to be dehumanized, but the feeling is primarily terror, real terror. These Nazi soldiers did not identify with us on a human level, so that if our babies are torn from their mothers, that doesn't affect them because we're not the same kind of human beings. And they have the guns and they have the power. So it's just sheer terror, where another human being doesn't have any kind of empathy for you.
All around her, Irene witnessed the humiliation and degradation of her fellow Jews. She had her sister Serena to turn to, but both of them were teenagers when they were in Auschwitz, and most of their family was gone. Auschwitz was a massive complex that held thousands of prisoners across several subsites. Author and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel and author and Holocaust victim Anne Frank were in the Auschwitz complex at the time Irene was there. But more importantly, and miraculously for Irene, 2 other people were there that had survived the selection process, her mother's sisters.
And they were exceedingly wonderful people, especially one of them who had a way about her to make you feel safe, to remind you that you are precious to her, that she remind you that you are her sister's daughter and not a subhuman being. And I didn't feel so totally alone with her around. To me, she is one of the angels. She died not so long ago. She did survive the camps, but she was one of the human beings who in those circumstances maintained her humanity and helped for others to maintain theirs.
Irene would need every ounce of her humanity to survive what was to come. By 1945, Germany's defeat in the war was inevitable, but the Nazis were determined to torture the Jewish people until the bitter end. As the front lines approached their outlying camps, the Nazis forced prisoners on death marches deeper inside their borders. Irene, Serena, and their aunts were forced out of Auschwitz on a death march towards the Ravensbrück camp. They ended up just west of Ravensbrück in a camp called Neustadt Gleba, nearly 450 miles away.
This definitely turned out to be a death march. We were not fed or taken care of in any way. Anyone who fell from exhaustion or sat down was shot. Took us on the highways in January, the snow, the cold, terrible. The road was filled with people being taken deeper into Germany. Our numbers were just totally decimated because they took us, first of all, on the road for days and nights. There was no facility, no food, no water, nothing, and no shelter. And then occasionally they would stop us in another concentration camp, which was already overloaded. Our last trip was in open cattle cars in the winter. We ended up near Hamburg in a camp where, again, the system just didn't function anymore. And we ended up really starving there for 5 months. And my mother's 2 young sisters were with us all this time, and one of them now caught typhus, and she was taken from there back to a place, to Ravensbrück, which had gas chambers. This one didn't have. And then at the very end, almost at the very end, my sister was picked out because she was already like a skeleton. And then I volunteered to go with her because I couldn't bear staying alone.
Irene knew what her choice meant. Although she had survived the most brutal of concentration camps, the constant threat of discovery by Nazi soldiers, and a forced death march in the bitter cold of winter, she did not want to go on without her sister. She knew that they would both be sent to the gas chamber to die.
They put us with other women selected into a room awaiting a truck to take us to a killing area, because this camp didn't have a gas chamber. But perhaps because of the approaching Russian front and the resulting chaos, the truck never arrived. We actually, my sister and I, survived that day, and survived altogether because the truck didn't arrive that day.
How was your liberation process, and how did you eventually get home and survive those days?
When the Russian army finally caught up with where we were near Hamburg, that particular unit, they came into the camp. First we saw the guard tower empty, and we realized something happened. The guards were gone, and we waited to see if that was for real. And then a couple of days later, some Russian soldiers arrived, and they took a look at us, and they left, and we never saw them again. And so we were left there without any medical help, any transportation, any food. We were left in very desperate conditions. Some of the women drifted out into the nearest town and found their abandoned homes because the German civilian population fled when the Russian army approached. And so there were a lot of empty homes, and some of us would just leave the camp and get into an empty house and just wait a few days, rest up. You know, there was nothing to eat, there was nothing, no medical supply or anything. We found a hospital in the town, and some of us entered the hospital just to rest.
It took some time for Irene and her fellow survivors to trust that they had, in fact, been liberated, that they were to go free. Every freedom had been taken from them in the world that they had come from, even the freedom to have a family and to be a child.
From my immediate family of 8, only Serena, my older sister, and I survived. All 13 of my young cousins perished along with their mothers. When I saw children in the town after the war, I stopped and stared at them. I had not seen children in almost a year and a half. Children were condemned to death in the world I had just come from.
After the liberation, how did you get your life back to essentially normal?
After a few days, we would say, well, we have to get moving towards home. And we would actually walk on the highway and hitchhike and things like that. And it took us months to get to where we finally ended up in Prague, Czechoslovakia. We were not going to go back to our homes because we never wanted to go back to the place where people hated us and threw us out. And so what to do next, where to go? And so we stayed in this place for a couple of years, trying to reestablish our identity. We had no identification papers or birth certificates and anything else. Identification papers had to be reconstructed through witnesses. And then we applied to come to this country, and that wasn't simple. There was a quota on how many they allowed in. The bigger problems set in after we were liberated, and yes, you survived, and yes, you look around and everybody is dead, and you have no place to go, and your position in the world has changed enormously. You're not, it's very complicated, especially for people older than me. How to pick up the pieces and where to begin, and you leave your continent. Everybody wanted to leave Europe, and the problems are not over, and you suddenly have new problems. You can't even deal with the old traumas because now you have new languages, new jobs, you have no money, you have no status. Whoever you were before, you're an immigrant. You don't, all kinds of difficulties. I arrived in Brooklyn, New York. I was 16 by now, and members of the family that I did have, aunts and cousins, they insisted that I go back to school right away because every time after the war, everybody was telling me, you're a child, you must go to school. In Auschwitz, mentioning that I was a child would have been the end of me, but suddenly I was a child. But at 16 and all that I went through, I didn't feel much like a child at all. And yet they put me into a huge high school in Brooklyn, New York. 5,000 students of people like you and others who, there was a war, they knew there was a war, but they certainly had their normal routine. And I didn't speak English, and I just wandered around the halls. I was in and out of classrooms. Nobody cared. Nobody knew if I was there. I was knocking around. And somehow I got a grip of myself, and somehow I graduated high school. But it was very difficult because I was not normal. I had experiences they had absolutely no idea about. I had a tattoo on my arm, which people didn't understand. In those days, tattoos were not common at all. And I would be asked by my classmates, what did you do to yourself? Is that your phone number? What is that thing? And I would break out in a sweat at the very idea that I had to answer that.
For Irene, explaining to her new American classmates what she had just been through would have been both traumatic and nearly impossible. At the end of World War II, many Americans knew very little about the atrocities the Nazis had perpetrated on the Jewish people. How do you begin to explain a situation so immeasurably cruel that it's difficult to comprehend?
Having seen how cunning propaganda and teaching of hate can make people believe that genocide is possible and even a patriotic duty, that killing a civilian population, including their children, is necessary. And having witnessed how the best creative minds in the fields of art and medicine and law and business and religion were enthusiastically enlisted in such a fiendish cause, under the banner of nationalism, it is really very difficult to continue to have much faith in mankind.
Irene, her family, her friends, and all the Jewish people of Europe had been betrayed by their fellow man. The betrayal prompts some of the most troubling questions surrounding the Holocaust. How did good people allow this to go on? Why didn't more people help?
It was very dangerous for people to show any kind of help or consideration to Jews. It was extremely dangerous because anyone who can point out another person that he helped a Jew or he hid a Jew or he gave him a meal or something was immediately interrogated and threatened. And their own families were in danger. There is no doubt about that. So the system of terror is such that everybody's terrorized, the victim and the victimizer. If they don't toe the line, they become the victims. So I understand that. But aside from that, once the propaganda took hold, there was such a fervor of believing that it's right to discriminate and to humiliate and to confiscate their stuff. There was such a fervor about it that it became patriotism of its own. And so people eagerly did it. They were eager to catch a Jew who was hiding and take him to the Gestapo, and they would be rewarded for it. So it turned from being victims themselves by not being able to associate with people and express an opinion, to totally falling for it, to believe it. And then even after the war, people would say, how could you have done such and such? It was the law. We followed the law. And the law spelled out all the things you could do to these people. And so it became part of patriotism, part of being loyal. It was no longer something that you didn't want to do. You wanted to do it, and you benefited from it.
Irene says that the system of terror that the Nazis instituted, the propaganda they used, and the effect of that propaganda on society are things we should never forget and never stop studying. What happened during the Holocaust was more than a historical event.
What I experienced and Jewish people experienced was something extraordinarily evil and extraordinarily different in the middle of the 20th century. That it wasn't part of the war. It was a genocide within the war. And you can't just say, well, it's over, people died in the war. No, this was some kind of a setback for Western civilization. And I don't think it's not only Jews who understand that, because I think it affected Christian religion in a big way, because the Christian Europe should have reacted better to it. It affected morality, the power structure of what people can do to each other. It was just some kind of a breakdown of civilization in a bigger way than just what war can do. War has certain rules. It's not obeyed, but there are rules for war. You have to avoid to hurt civilians, and it doesn't always carry it out, but this had no rules. The rule here was kill and kill and kill, and most of all kill young children so there won't be a new generation, kill childbearing women so there won't be a new generation, kill the old and the sick because they're useless, and confiscate their property and annihilate a whole group of people without ever being charged of any kind of crime. There was something very vicious and subhuman in carrying out such a scheme. So it has to be talked about.
Have you ever found it in your heart to forgive the Nazi officers who oppressed you?
Well, I will have an opportunity to talk to a Nazi, actually. I'm going to Germany this coming Sunday. I'll be a witness at a trial that is currently going on. The German government is trying a former Nazi who was a young man when he was on the ramp at Auschwitz.
Oskar Groening was a Nazi officer stationed at Auschwitz. Known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz, his job was to collect the money and valuables from prisoners as they arrived on the platform, keep accounts of the monetary value, and send the funds back to Berlin. Groening was 23 at the time, and now at the age of 93, the German government had finally brought him to trial.
What they wanted is to find survivors who came from Hungary during the months of May and June 1944. In those 2 months, something like 400,000 Jews from Hungary were delivered to Auschwitz. And the killing just went on day and night. And he was there on the platform at the time doing his harmless little job of collecting valuables from people who were about to be killed. So should I forgive him for what he did so many years ago? I predict that I will not forgive him, because when he saw the atrocities, and he says, I saw atrocities. He says, I saw that the women and children went into the gas chambers, and I saw myself how the gas pellets were dropped through the roof into the chamber, and I heard the blood-curdling screams, and then I heard the screams getting lower, and then there was silence. And I would like to ask him, when you heard that, did you throw up? What did you do? Go back to your station at the ramp and collect some more money and valuables?
Irene was one of several Auschwitz survivors that testified at Groening's trial. Though Groening admitted that he is morally guilty for his association with Nazi acts of terror, he insisted that he never personally murdered anyone. For Irene, he was part of the system that murdered her family, and she went to Germany hoping for answers.
If he had sat there in his Nazi uniform as a 13-year-old, I would have been terrified, and as an 84-year-old, I would be terrified. But I was looking at an old man and thinking, how could all that have happened? What was he thinking when he was 21, 22, doing what he did? And why doesn't he come forward and say, I'm very sorry, I didn't think, or I was misled, or I was stupid, or I was... Why not come and give people some understanding of what was he thinking? He should hear what his patriotism and his devotion to Hitler caused to people.
Irene was able to testify at Groening's trial. She sat 20 feet away from the former Nazi and recounted her family's story. She talked about being persecuted in her town, being deported to the ghetto, and ultimately to Auschwitz, and losing most of her family to the gas chambers. She was able to tell Groening the effect that he and the Nazi regime had on her life. When she finished, he looked at his watch. In the end, Groening was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Today, Irene shares her story with students, not just as a history lesson, but as a vehicle for understanding the concept of humanity. The Holocaust is what can result when we cross the boundaries of basic civility, when we are careless with how we treat each other.
It's really interesting to see the follow-up of how students and people treat each other is really at the core. That a human being, we all have the same kind of feelings, whether it comes to family or loss or or pain or whatever. And if you can empathize and recognize that we all feel the same kind of pain and the same concerns, then you won't be so cruel. It's hard to do that with children because they want to belong. They want to be like everybody else, and they'll inflict pain on other students just that they should belong to the right group. But it sort of starts there, this idea of not accepting others. You don't have to be friends with everybody, but you can't go out of your way to humiliate them and isolate them.
So we're going to be the last generation that has the chance to talk to Holocaust survivors. So when we teach our children about the Holocaust, what do you think is the most important thing we teach them?
It's an excellent question. What worries me most is how easily young people and adults can be convinced to follow an ideology or a charismatic leader. How do we get young people to think and analyze what they hear? And today is just as important as it ever was. We're all bombarded by all kinds of ideologies. What is the truth? Very difficult to find out the truth. And you young people are in a position to try to sort it out by thinking, learning how to analyze what you hear. These people will be voting someday, and that's an even bigger job, because they have to be willing to educate themselves in a big way to vote in the right way. It doesn't matter that they have to vote one party or the other party. They should just be informed why they're doing it.
We just wanted to say thank you for coming out here today and talking to us. It really means a lot.
Yeah.
You're very welcome, and keep my advice of getting well informed and thinking and analyzing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you don't fall for any crazy stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
With smiles and handshakes, Irene finished her presentation to Woodson High School students. It's one of many presentations she'll do this year, sharing a story that is both painful and important.
All the people who have gone through this are different than they would have been, profoundly different. And I think I am profoundly different as a person than I would have been had I gone through normal schooling and family and all the rest. You're touched by something that's difficult to overcome, like what we talked about before, like your trust in human beings. And there is a lot of disappointment in that, and even a lot of pain. The pain never goes away, the loss. Now, of course, I've had a great joy from my family. That is the best that one can do, is to have children and grandchildren, and had a very fine husband for 63 years.